Good evening. Today is Sunday, May 24th, 2026. I'm Rich Stevens, and this is the Cold Take. What you're about to hear is news from this week, taken only from primary sources like press conferences and court documents. You can find those sources and attribution for every story at thecoldtake.com. We begin in California, where on Monday, May 18th, 3 people were killed in a shooting at the Islamic Center of San Diego. Police say the first active shooter calls came in at 11:42 a.m. and officers arrived 4 minutes later. Amin Abdullah, the Islamic Center's security guard, exchanged gunfire with the shooters and radioed for a lockdown before he was killed. That delay kept the shooters from reaching areas where as many as 140 children were located. The shooters entered the building, moved through empty rooms, and then went back outside. There, police say they killed Mansoor Kaziha and Nadir Awad. No children or officers were injured. Police identified the shooters as an 18-year-old and a 17-year-old who were found dead in a vehicle several blocks away. Earlier that morning, one shooter's mother called the police to report him missing. She later reported missing weapons, a possible suicide note, and threatening, hate-filled writings. The FBI says the shooters appear to have been radicalized online. Investigators seized more than 30 guns, a crossbow, ammunition, tactical gear, and electronics from residences connected to the shooters. On Saturday, May 16th, Long Island Railroad workers went on strike for the first time in 30 years. 5 unions, representing about 3,500 workers, walked out after contract talks failed. The fight was mainly over wages. The unions said workers had gone more than 3 years without raises. The MTA said the union demands could force fare hikes or higher taxes. Before the strike, Governor Hochul said the LIRR carries nearly 300,000 riders per day and called it the lifeblood of Long Island. Once the strike began, New York moved to a backup plan. Shuttle buses for essential workers, extra subway trains on standby, city field parking for the 7 train, and remote work where possible. The strike ended on Monday, May 18th, after the unions and MTA reached a tentative deal. Hochul said the agreement gives workers fair wages without additional fare hikes or tax increases. MTA says service resumed Tuesday at noon, and monthly ticket holders were approved for refunds covering the suspended service. This episode of The Cold Take is brought to you by Redwood Empire Pipe Dream Bourbon. Not because they're giving me any money, but because this whole thing feels like a pipe dream, however many months in with less than 300 subscribers. You could subscribe, and then I'd have more subscribers. On Sunday, May 17th, 2 U.S. Navy EA-18G Growlers collided during the Gunfighter Skies Air Show at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho. The 366th Fighter Wing says the aircraft crashed on Grandview Highway after the mid-air collision, and all 4 aircrew successfully ejected. The wing says emergency responders secured the scene, and Highway 167 was closed during the investigation. Colonel David Gunter said, quote, "First and foremost, we are incredibly thankful that everyone involved in today's incident is safe." Luigi Mangione was back in court Monday, May 18th, as a judge ruled what evidence prosecutors can use in the killing of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. The judge suppressed items found during the first backpack search at the Altoona McDonald's, including a loaded magazine, cell phone, passport, wallet, and computer chip. The court's reasoning was that the backpack had already been moved away from Mangione, he was surrounded by officers, and the bag was under police control. But the gun and notebook are still allowed. The court said the notebook was not opened at McDonald's, and the gun was found later at the police station during a valid inventory search. Follow the channel for updates in this case. 2 election stories hit this week. In Maryland, the State Board of Elections says a printing error caused some mail-in voters to receive the wrong party ballot for the gubernatorial primary. The state says affected voters will get replacement ballots marked, quote, all caps replacement ballot. And the first ballots have been voided. SBE says there's no risk of duplicate voting because each return envelope has a unique identifier and only one ballot can be accepted per voter. While this is officially being described as an elections error, California is a little bit different. Hit subscribe to be notified about other election news. On Monday, May 18th, DOJ charged Brenda Lee Brown Armstrong of Marina del Rey with paying another person to register to vote. Prosecutors say Armstrong worked as a petition circulator and was paid to gather signatures from registered voters for California ballot petitions. DOJ says she regularly paid people on Skid Row $2 to $3 to sign petitions and then began paying people to complete voter registration forms. Prosecutors say some homeless individuals used Armstrong's former Los Angeles address on the forms. Because California automatically mails ballots to all registered voters, DOJ says ballots in some of those cases could potentially be sent to an address where those people did not live or collect mail. Armstrong has agreed to plead guilty. On Tuesday, May 19th, Tyler Robinson was back in court in Utah in the Charlie Kirk murder case. The defense argued prosecutors violated the court's media rules by discussing an ATF firearms report outside court. They say prosecutors should have corrected any dispute over that report in court filings, not through media emails or television interviews. Prosecutors argued they were responding to misleading coverage after the defense said ATF could not match the bullet recovered at autopsy to the rifle tied to Robinson. The state says the report was inconclusive, meaning ATF could not identify the rifle but also could not exclude it. The defense also asked to close parts of the upcoming preliminary hearing if the state presents evidence that may not be admissible at trial. The state and media organizations objected, saying preliminary hearings are generally public. The judge did not rule from the bench. He set a WebEx ruling hearing for June 1st at 10 a.m. A separate in-person hearing on Utah's reliable hearsay rule is set for June 12th. And as always, follow for updates on that case. Updates this week on a case we first reported on last November. On Thursday, May 21st, a Newport News judge dismissed the criminal case against former Richneck Elementary assistant principal Ebony Parker. Parker had been charged after a 6-year-old student shot his teacher, Abby Zwerner, in January of 2023. The charges were 8 felony child neglect counts tied to the students in Zwerner's classroom. Prosecutors argued Parker failed to act after repeated warnings that the child may have had a gun at school. After the prosecution rested, Parker's defense moved to strike the charges, arguing the evidence did not prove a crime under Virginia law. The judge agreed and dismissed the case before it went to the jury. The court said the prosecution had presented legal theories, but not a crime under the current law. The judge said, if this conduct is going to be criminal, the General Assembly has to write that into the statute. So just for the record, a principal in Virginia has no legal duty to act if they're notified that a student may have a firearm at school. Zwerner previously won a $10 million verdict against the district over the shooting. Wow. Virginia needs to get their shit together. How is it not the principal's responsibility to go and make sure that a kid doesn't have a gun if somebody says, hey, I think this kid has a gun, and then someone else says, hey, I think this kid has a gun, and then a third person says, I'm pretty sure this kid has a gun? Lock it in, Virginia. On Thursday, May 21st, the Justice Department announced charges against 15 defendants in a Minnesota Medicaid and benefits fraud case involving more than $90 million in intended loss. The biggest new case involves autism services. Prosecutors say Shamso Ahmed Hassan and Hanan Mursal Yusuf were charged in an alleged $46.6 million scheme involving Minnesota Medicaid's autism program. DOJ says they paid kickbacks to families, sent children to autism centers, and billed Medicaid for services that were not provided or not reimbursable. DOJ says Minnesota autism claims went from around $600,000 in 2018 to more than $400 million by 2025. Other cases involve individualized home supports, integrated community supports, housing stabilization services, child care payments, and Feeding Our Future meal claims. One defendant is accused of billing for care to a recipient who required 24-hour support the day before that recipient was found deceased. Another case alleges $22.7 million in Medicaid reimbursements for home support services, even though prosecutors say the providers owned and controlled the homes where the services were supposedly provided. Separately in Minnesota, on Friday, May 22nd, Amy Bach was sentenced to 500 months in federal prison. Bach founded Feeding Our Future, the nonprofit at the center of the $250 million child nutrition fraud case in Minnesota. DOJ says Bach and Salim Saeed falsely claimed they served 91 million meals during COVID and fraudulently received federal funds meant to feed children. Federal prosecutors said Bach was not running a legitimate nonprofit. They said Feeding Our Future was a facade used to carry out fraud and that Bach controlled the money flowing through it. The Minnesota Legislative Auditor also found state oversight failures. The auditor says the Minnesota Department of Education found Feeding Our Futures seriously deficient twice, but deferred those findings. The report says MDE should have pursued termination months earlier. Bach also tried to shift the blame. In the government's sentencing filing, prosecutors said Bach directed anonymous emails claiming Tim Waltz, Keith Ellison, and MDE set her up as a scapegoat. Representative Ilhan Omar has also faced questions over her Meals Act and communications connected to Feeding Our Future. A Minnesota House committee tried to subpoena Omar-related documents, but that motion failed, and I think we all know why. On Friday, May 22nd, 2 attorneys were shot outside the Wake County Courthouse in Raleigh, North Carolina. Police identified the suspect as 57-year-old Gwendolyn White, who is charged with 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder. The victims were Mary Harris and Jeffrey Whitley, attorneys representing the town of Rollsville in a civil matter. The 2 attorneys had been in the same courtroom earlier that morning when White became belligerent, left the courthouse, went to her car, got a handgun, and shot the attorneys as they exited the building. White was taken into custody, and we'll bring you updates on this case as they're available. Moving over to politics, on Tuesday, May 19th, Republican primary voters in several states picked nominees for November, and one of the biggest results came in Kentucky. Unofficial results show Ed Gowron defeated incumbent Congressman Thomas Massie in Kentucky's 4th District. Gowron received 55% of the vote to Massie's 45%. Kentucky Republicans also voted in the race to replace Senator Mitch McConnell with Andy Barr, who won the Republican primary with 60% of the vote. In Alabama, Senator, or Coach if you prefer, Tommy Tuberville, won the Republican primary for governor with more than 85% of the vote. Meanwhile, the Republican primary for Tuberville's open Senate seat appears to be headed to a runoff. Representative Barry Moore led that race with just over 39%, followed by Jared Hudson and Steve Marshall. In Georgia, the Republican Senate primary also appears headed to a runoff. Representative Mike Collins led the field, while incumbent Congressman Buddy Carter finished behind him in the race for the Senate nomination. For more information on this story and other stories, visit thecoldtake.com. On Friday, May 22nd, Tulsi Gabbard announced she is resigning as Director of National Intelligence, effective June 30th. Gabbard said she was grateful for President Trump's trust and the opportunity to lead ODNI for the last year and a half. Her official post says her husband Abraham was recently diagnosed with an extremely rare form of bone cancer. Trump confirmed her resignation, saying, quote, "Unfortunately, after having done a great job, Tulsi Gabbard will be leaving the administration on June 30th. Aaron Lucas, Gabbard's principal deputy director of national intelligence, will serve as acting director. He is a former CIA chief of station with more than 20 years in the intelligence community. In markets, the Dow Jones closed at a record high of 50,579. This eclipsed the February 6th close by more than 400 points and comes after a 1,053 point gain in the index this week. That's 2.13% and significantly stronger than the other indexes were this week. NASDAQ gained 118 points, less than 0.5% up, and closed at 26,343. The S&P 500 picked up 65 points, a 0.88% gain, closing at 74.73. Gold finished the week at $4,523 an ounce, a $38 loss on the week. Switching over to sports, on Thursday, May 21st, NASCAR announced that Kyle Busch died after being hospitalized with severe pneumonia that progressed into sepsis. Busch was one of the most accomplished drivers in NASCAR history. He won 2 Cup Series championships in 2015 and 2019 and finished his career with 63 Cup Series wins. Across NASCAR's 3 series, he won 234 races, making him the winningest active driver in the sport when he died. He drove for Hendrick Motorsports, Joe Gibbs Racing, and Richard Childress Racing. He was aggressive, emotional, polarizing, and almost always fast. Busch is also the first active NASCAR Cup Series driver to die since Dale Earnhardt in 2001. He and Dale Earnhardt Jr. once had a strained relationship, with Earnhardt Jr. saying they had a challenging existence for many years, but eventually took the time to work through it, and by the end, he said Busch had become a good friend. NASCAR called him a future Hall of Famer and a rare talent who comes along once in a generation. Kyle Busch was 41 years old. Elsewhere in racing, on Sunday, May 17th, the number 80 Ravenel Mercedes-AMG GT3 won the 24 Hours at Nürburgring. It was the brand's first overall Nürburgring 24 win in 10 years. Max Verstappen looked set to win his first 24-hour Nürburgring start in the sister number 3 car. The car had led the race and was still in front with just under 3.5 hours left when driveshaft failure ended its run for the win. The number 80 Mercedes inherited control and finished the job. The 2026 Formula One Canadian Grand Prix is this weekend. The race itself will be underway when this video goes live, but it's a sprint weekend, so there's still plenty to talk about. George Russell qualified on pole for the sprint race with his teammate Antonelli beside him on the front row. The McLarens locked out second row, followed by the Ferraris and then the Red Bulls. Russell ran Antonelli off the road twice, but he wasn't penalized because the FIA is doing all it can to completely ruin the sport. He went on to finish first ahead of Lando Norris and then Antonelli. Qualifying for the main race was nearly identical, except Charles Leclerc wound up behind the Red Bull cars. You can watch that if you feel like it. In the Stanley Cup playoffs, the Las Vegas Golden Knights lead the Colorado Avalanche 2-0 in the Western Conference Finals. In the East, the Hurricanes and Canadiens are tied 1-1. In the NBA playoffs, Oklahoma City has a 2-1 lead over the Spurs in the West, while the Knicks are up 3-0 on the Cavs. Finally, in MLB, the Yankees have slipped 5.5 games behind the Rays in the AL East. They've lost 10 of their last 14, including series losses to the Orioles and Mets. Atlanta controls the NL East with a 9.5 game lead over the Phillies, and the Dodgers hold a half-game lead in the NL West over the Padres. And like it or not, that's what happened. I am Rich Stevens, and this has been The Colt Take. Hey, I didn't put it in the news because I'm pretty annoyed about it, but the SEC baseball tournament is going on, the SEC softball tournament is going on, and I would assume all the other conferences also that I don't watch. The Florida women beat Texas A&M 12-2 yesterday. That was nice. And the boys, after a rain delay, gave up a 4-run lead and lost to Georgia. So they're out.